G20 summit is underway in Osaka, Japan. President Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping will be meeting tomorrow, which is technically at 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. Take a listen to what President Trump told reporters earlier today.
We're going to have a meeting with President Xi of China tomorrow, as you probably have heard. There seems to be a rumor about that, and we are indeed, and we look forward to it. I think it'll be productive, and who knows, but I think it'll be productive. At a minimum, it will be productive. We'll see what happens and what comes out of it.
Indeed, we will see what happens. This coming as Bloomberg reports President Xi hinted Trump is a bully who undermines others, although he did not mention the president by name. So joining us now to discuss is the Heritage Foundation policy analyst Riley Walters. And Riley, first up, I guess the question everyone's asking right now, what are your expectations going into the weekend to see if there's a chance we might get a deal with China?
Well, it sounds like the meeting that they're going to have is going to be productive, at least. I think what we're going to see at this meeting is similar to what we saw when they met last year at the G20 in Argentina. It'll be a truce of sorts. Basically, both sides will agree that neither will levy any new tariffs, and they will restart negotiations toward a deal. But I don't expect to see that deal by the end of this weekend.
The other news, too, out today is Apple is tapping a Chinese contractor to manufacture its new Mac Pro computer in China, according to the Wall Street Journal. That would shift production from here in the U.S. over there. And, of course, President Trump has recently spoken out on Apple and other companies who are making similar moves. So how much of that do you think adds fuel to the fire going into this weekend?
Well, as we've seen over the last couple of years, as trade between the United States and China becomes more expensive, it's costly to have an increase of volume of trade between the two. So what companies are adopting are a made in China for China policy, just like they're adapting a made in the U.S. for the U.S. or made in Mexico for the U.S. policy. So what you are seeing some division between the two economies when it comes to trade, but for companies' sake, this is more about just reducing the volume, localizing supply chains, and reducing some of the cost to them in production.
Hi, Riley. Emily here. I just want to ask, since the Wall Street Journal is reporting that Xi Jinping will be coming to the table with some points that he wants the U.S. side to address, what do you think are the sticking points right now, and what is it going to take to actually see meaningful progress on the table here?
Well, one of the impediments to getting a deal done is really what the United States decides with the tariffs, whether they decide to remove all of the tariffs that are on $250 billion worth of goods, of Chinese goods that Americans buy, or whether it's a reduction. So maybe removing tariffs on just $200 billion worth, but not $50 billion worth. And so this is becoming a sticking point. I'm sure it's something that they'll try and figure out over the weekend. Whether they'll actually figure it out or not, we'll see.
Well, that was one of the sticking points. President Trump was also asked by a reporter if he had committed to changing that tariff rate you're discussing there, if he was committed to lifting or if he's already committed to keeping them in place. And he says, we'll see. So, I mean, when we're talking about that, that's one thing on the U.S. side. Obviously, President Trump has pulled that tariff lever. On the Chinese side, though, they had been pushing about lifting Huawei restrictions. President Trump has obviously used that tool. So, I mean, when you look at the table as we see it now, which one of those do you think might be more likely to be pulled when we're talking about using levers to meet in the middle?
Well, obviously, they will talk about both at this meeting. For the Chinese government, Huawei and adding Huawei to the entities list was more of an offense, I think, than actually the recent increase in tariffs, given the importance that Huawei plays to the Chinese government. So they will talk about both. I don't want to necessarily combine the two issues together too much, because the United States government, they will continue to pursue its actions against Huawei on a separate course, separate from the trade deal that we could potentially have with China one day. But I think they could come to some sort of agreement on Huawei as well with trade at some point, the two presidents, I mean.
All right. Riley Walters, thank you so much for breaking it down. We'll see what happens this weekend. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
Emily, I also just want to note one thing, too, here, though. When we were talking before the show, we were talking about a new Deutsche Bank note that was looking at what might come out of this as well, whether it's a deal or not a deal. Regardless, just the way that consumer confidence in investors and companies have been kind of trying to brace for what might come out of it, Deutsche Bank was making the argument that it's much more likely to not see really that much of an impact in a positive direction, because companies have been trying to figure out how realistic any of the headlines we're getting out of China or the trade front actually are.
Well, if you think about it, what really sparked this market rally at the beginning of the year were two things. So it was the Fed's pivot, and then it was the China trade optimism. So we saw really a huge pivot that happened in May when basically the trade talks broke down, and then the markets reacted immediately to that. We saw consumer confidence taking a tumble, just all these different indicators of business and consumer confidence really going by the wayside because of that. But what this Deutsche Bank note is saying is that even if we do get a deal, like an actual deal in the near term, we won't actually see those things start to recover for some time because now there is just so much uncertainty that these will even last.
Yeah, it's hard to really undo that uncertainty when you've had such a long period, extended period, of people trying to figure out what the truth is. Even if a positive headline comes out, it'll be, as this note points out, quite a bit of time before you start to see an uptick. Of course, investors are hoping for that uptick.